Imagine an object the size of the Empire State Building, right? But it's tipped on its side and it's just plowing through a muddy ditch in the middle of the Egyptian desert.
Right, just a massive wall of steel.
Exactly. And now imagine a sudden gust of wind catches the shipping containers stacked on the deck,
Yeah.
like acting like a giant uncontrollable sail.
Yeah, because they stack those things so incredibly high.
They really do. So the ship gets pushed slightly off course. The bow just wedges right into the sandy bank.
Oh, man.
Yeah, and the stern swings around, hits the other side, and boom, it is completely stuck. And suddenly, just because the wind blew a little too hard on a random Tuesday morning, the entire global economy starts bleeding something to the tune of $10 billion a day.
10 billion. Every single day. It's
Right.
wild.
It is wild. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're exploring the bottlenecks of the world. And just a quick note before we unpack how these fragile geographic choke points dictate global wealth, military leverage, and, the cost of your groceries.
Yeah.
But what we are discussing today involves global economics and trade, but it is strictly for informational and educational purposes. This is not financial advice.
No, definitely not. But it is a profound reality check for all of us. Because I think we've collectively developed this illusion that we live in the cloud.
Oh, totally. We think everything is digital.
Right. We think of the modern economy as this weightless, wireless, borderless digital realm. You tap a piece of glass in your hand, and a package just magically manifests on your porch a day later.
Like teleportation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We are completely insulated from the physical reality of how our civilization actually functions.
That is the perfect way to frame it, honestly, the illusion of the cloud. Because the sources we're looking at today for this deep dive, they just shatter that illusion completely.
They really do.
Like our physical goods, our food, the raw materials for the electronics you're using to listen to this right now, the energy that powers the servers hosting that digital cloud, none of it travels through the ether.
No, it is dragged across oceans on massive steel barges.
Yeah. And more importantly, to get from where it's made to where you actually consume it, it has to squeeze through a handful of these incredibly narrow, terrifyingly precarious geographic straws.
To really understand the global economy, you have to look at a map, not a spreadsheet. I always say, if you visualize global trade as a massive hourglass,
Oh, okay. I like that analogy.
right? So you have billions of tons of raw materials and manufactured goods in the top bulb,
Mhm.
and then billions of hungry consumers and energy-dependent cities in the bottom bulb.
Right.
But all of that sand, all of that global wealth, it has to pass through the tiny pinched neck in the middle. These specific straits and canals are that pinched neck.
So the mission today is to figure out who controls those pinched necks. Because basically, if you control the bottleneck, you hold the whole world hostage.
You do.
And I want to start by asking you about a concept that kept coming up in the research. To understand why a ship captain would willingly sail into a dangerous or, a highly congested or politically explosive waterway, the sources point to a core economic concept called inelastic demand.
Yes, exactly.
Could you just break down what that actually means in the context of, like, a massive cargo ship?
Sure. So inelastic demand is basically the foundational concept of a choke point. In a normal elastic market, if the price of coffee at your local shop goes way up, what do?
I just make it at home or go to a different shop.
Exactly. Your demand changes based on price or difficulty. But inelastic demand means you literally have no other choice.
Like zero alternatives.
Right.
Yeah.
If you're navigating a massive supertanker, say you're carrying 2 million barrels of crude oil from the Persian Gulf to a refinery in Japan, and you reach a specific narrow waterway, you cannot simply choose to go a different way just because the toll is high or the waters are a bit risky.
Because what's the alternative?
The alternative is sailing all the way around an entire continent. That would add weeks to your journey and millions of dollars in fuel costs, which would utterly bankrupt the voyage.
Oh, wow. So you are locked in. The physical geography leaves you zero alternatives.
You must pass through. The demand for that specific stretch of water is deeply inelastic. And the geopolitical consequence of that is just immense. Whoever controls that narrow waterway essentially holds a monopoly on global movement.
They have total leverage.
Total leverage. They don't need to manufacture anything. They don't invent anything. They literally just have to stand at the gate.
That's crazy.
Yeah. And today we're going to look at the actual mechanisms of how these physical choke points dictate global inflation, how they trigger energy crises, and how empires literally rise and fall based entirely on who holds the keys to these gates.
Okay, I want to start where the blueprint for the choke point empire was essentially perfected. We're heading to Southeast Asia to look at this 500-year prize, the Strait of Malacca.
Oh, yeah. It's arguably the most historically contested and busiest maritime corridor on the planet.
And the origin story of how this specific strait became the center of the global economy is just fascinating. Because according to the historical texts in our sources, it didn't start with some massive naval fleet or a grand engineering project.
No, not at all.
It started with a displaced, runaway nobleman sitting under a tree.
Right, the Indian gooseberry tree, which is known locally as the Malacca tree.
Yeah. So picture this. It's the late 14th century. A Sumatran prince named Parameswara is fleeing his enemies. He's essentially a refugee royal, right? Just looking for a place to survive.
Just trying to lay low.
Exactly. And he ends up resting under this Malacca tree, looking out over this small, sleepy fishing village where a local river meets the sea. Why does he look at this quiet little village and decide, yeah, this is the perfect place to build an empire? Like, what does he actually see in the geography?
He sees a geographic goldmine.
Yeah.
I mean, the Strait of Malacca sits perfectly between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. If you want to trade between India, the Middle East, and China, you have to pass through this corridor.
You have to.
Yeah, but more importantly, the specific spot Parameswara chose offered a natural, protected harbor. So the massive, terrifying monsoon swells of the Indian Ocean are blocked by the island of Sumatra.
Oh, so he has this calm, safe haven right on the edge of the world's busiest highway.
Exactly.
But, having a good location doesn't automatically force ships to stop and give you their money. The sources detail a pretty ruthless strategy he used to kickstart his economy. He didn't start farming or building up a manufacturing base. He forged an alliance with a group called the Orang Laut.
Right, the Orang Laut.
Who were they, and how did they help him build this toll booth?
So the Orang Laut translate to the sea people. They were this nomadic maritime population, incredibly skilled navigators who lived entirely on the water.
Right.
And to be perfectly blunt, they were also fierce, highly effective pirates.
Wow.
Parameswara realized he couldn't build a navy from scratch, so he essentially franchised the local piracy. He teamed up with the Orang Laut to act as his personal enforcers.
Okay, so he's basically using them as a maritime mafia.
That is a very accurate way to look at it.
Right.
The Orang Laut would go out into the strait, intercept passing merchant ships, and strongly, quote-unquote, encourage them to dock at Parameswara's new port of Malacca.
And if they said no?
If a merchant ship refused, they were attacked, their cargo was seized, and they were likely sunk.
Well. But the real genius of it seems to be what happened after the merchants were forced into the port, because he didn't just rob them blind, right? He offered them a highly organized, secure environment.
Yes.
He built warehouses, provided security guards, established a really clear, predictable tax system. He basically traded the threat of piracy for a guaranteed safe zone and just took a cut of their profits as the price of admission.
Which brings us to another vital economic concept, rent-seeking. Parameswara's strategy is a textbook, historical masterclass in rent-seeking behavior.
Okay, so how does rent-seeking differ from just running a regular business?
Well, when you run a normal business, you create new wealth, right? You bake bread, you build a house, you invent a new technology. You're adding value to the economy.
Right, making something new.
Exactly. Rent-seeking is when an entity seeks to extract wealth from the existing environment without actually producing any new goods or services.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, you manipulate the environment in this case, utilizing the natural bottleneck of the geography and the threat of maritime force to charge others a fee simply for existing in or passing through that space.
So he didn't grow the spices in India, and he didn't weave the silk in China. He literally just put a toll booth on the only road between them and charged a premium for the safety he was simultaneously threatening to take away.
Precisely. And the resulting wealth allowed the Malacca Sultanate to build a staggeringly sophisticated administration.
Yeah, I read they appointed 4 different harbor masters.
Yes. To handle the massive influx of forced, diverse traffic, each harbor master was dedicated to a specific cultural and linguistic group: Gujarati, Bengali, Malay, and East Asian.
That's super organized.
It was. They standardized weights and measures, they provided translators. They essentially used forced compliance to subsidize a vibrant, highly efficient, multicultural free market.
It sounds almost like a maritime utopia. But history shows that whenever someone builds a toll booth that profitable, someone with bigger guns eventually shows up to take it.
That's usually how it goes.
And in 1511, the Portuguese arrived.
Right. Alfonso de Albuquerque.
Yeah, and I was reading Albuquerque's accounts in the sources, and it is a fascinating, incredibly violent culture clash. because Portugal didn't have much to export to Asia. They were just this small nation on the edge of Europe.
Right.
So their strategy wasn't to compete in the market, but to hijack the entire market by force. But how does a small fleet of Portuguese ships take down an entrenched, super wealthy sultanate?
It came down to a revolution in military technology. See, the Sultanate of Malacca had a massive army. They had thousands of skilled archers, and they even deployed literal war elephants to defend the city.
War elephants, that is
It
wild.
was an incredibly formidable land force. But Albuquerque didn't fight a land war. He utilized heavy, ship-mounted naval artillery.
So cannons mounted on floating fortresses.
Yes, the Portuguese galleons could just sit offshore, completely out of range of the Sultan's archers, and simply bombard the city's defenses into rubble.
Oh man, the elephants couldn't do anything about that.
The war elephants were completely useless against naval bombardment. Albuquerque took the city, and his rationale was entirely rooted in macroeconomics. He explicitly wrote to his king that by taking the trade of Malacca out of Muslim hands, he would completely ruin the economies of Cairo and Venice.
Wow, he understood the supply chain perfectly. He knew that the spices making Venice filthy rich were flowing through this one specific strait. Cut the root and the tree dies.
Exactly. However, taking a choke point is very different from successfully running one.
Right.
The Portuguese were religious crusaders as much as they were merchants. They treated the diverse Muslim merchant population terribly, even tearing down local mosques to build Catholic churches.
Which is a terrible business strategy if your entire economy relies on Muslim merchants wanting to dock at your port.
Predictably, the merchants just fled to rival ports in the region. The Portuguese held the physical geography, but they destroyed the delicate, multicultural ecosystem that made the geography valuable in the first place.
That sets the stage perfectly for the next shift in power, which isn't a kingdom or a crusade, but a literal corporation. In 1641, the Dutch arrive. But the sources point out this wasn't the Dutch government acting alone. This was the Dutch East India Company, the VOC.
The dawn of early modern militarized capitalism.
Yeah, and the VOC brings a totally different approach. They don't care about spreading religion. Their mandate is strictly to generate returns for their shareholders back in Amsterdam.
Right.
So they conquer Malacca, but they don't try to rebuild the free market. They implement something much darker.
They implement a monopsony.
Okay, break that down for us.
So most people understand what a monopoly is, right? It's a market condition where there is only one seller, so they can charge whatever they want. A monopsony is the inverse. It's a market condition where there is only one buyer.
Wait, how does a corporation enforce a monopsony across thousands of miles of ocean?
Through systematic contractual violence. The Dutch East India Company used their massive naval fleet to blockade alternative ports and physically force the local rulers and farmers across the Indonesian archipelago to sign exclusive treaties.
Oh, wow.
If you grew nutmeg, cloves, or mace, you were legally obligated to sell your entire harvest exclusively to the VOC.
And because the VOC is the only legal buyer, they just get to dictate the price.
They drove the prices into the dirt.
Yeah.
If you were a local spice farmer, you sold your crop to the Dutch for pennies, or you didn't sell it at all.
That's awful.
And if you were caught trying to sell to an independent merchant, which the Dutch subtly categorized as smuggling, the VOC would burn your village and destroy your spice trees.
Ah.
They used their control of the Malacca choke point to enforce a regional monopsony, extracting maximum wealth for their shareholders while completely impoverishing the local populations who actually produce the goods.
Okay, so we've gone from a clever prince running a protection racket to a Portuguese crusade to a brutal corporate monopsony. That's the history. But let's bring it to the present day, because this 500-year battleground hasn't lost its importance. If anything, the numbers suggest it's more critical now than it ever was during the spice trade.
Oh, without a doubt. The modern statistics for the Strait of Malacca are just staggering. In the first half of the current decade, it consistently handled over 23 million barrels of oil every single day.
To put that in perspective for the listener, how much of the global maritime oil trade is squeezing through this one passage?
It's approaching 30% of the entire global maritime oil trade.
30%.
Yeah. Think about the energy required to run the economies of China, Japan, India, and South Korea. Almost a third of the oil moving on the oceans passes through this corridor. Furthermore, over 94,000 commercial vessels transit the strait annually, carrying about a quarter of all the world's traded goods.
Everything from electronics to raw materials?
Exactly. Electronics from Taiwan, manufactured goods from China, raw materials from Africa,
Mm.
it all funnels into this gap.
But looking at the geographic map in our sources, it is an incredibly tight squeeze. You have Malaysia on one side, Indonesia on the other, and Singapore sitting right at the southern exit. With that much wealth and energy flowing through, are the borders actually settled, or are they still fighting over who owns the water?
Well, the legacy of colonial map drawing is still causing daily friction there. Back in 1824, the British and the Dutch drew a line on a map to divide their spheres of influence, essentially creating the modern borders of Malaysia and Indonesia.
Okay.
But they never precisely delimited the maritime boundaries in the water itself,
They just drew a rough line and said, we'll figure the water out later.
pretty much. And later has proven incredibly difficult. While Malaysia and Indonesia have agreed on some basic territorial sea limits close to their shores, there's a massive unresolved conflict regarding their exclusive economic zones.
Let's define that quickly for the listener. The Exclusive Economic Zone, or EEZ, what does that actually grant a country?
So it's an area of the ocean extending beyond a country's territorial waters, where that specific nation has the exclusive sovereign rights to explore, exploit, and manage the natural marine resources.
Like drilling for oil.
Exactly. The rights to drill for offshore oil and natural gas, and critically, the rights to all the fish in the water.
Ah, okay. So because Malaysia and Indonesia haven't finalized exactly where one country's EEZ ends and the other's begins in the northern part of the strait, they have this overlapping claim. The sources call this the gray area. How does that actually play out on the water?
Imagine two rival restaurants located next to each other on a really busy street. They both claim the exact same stretch of the sidewalk for their outdoor seating.
Okay, I can picture that.
Because neither side backs down, the local police from both precincts start showing up and arresting the waiters from the rival restaurant for trespassing.
That is a brilliant analogy.
That is exactly what was happening with the local fishermen. Between 2008 and 2012, this overlapping claim turned into a real low-level maritime conflict.
Overfish.
Overfish. Malaysian maritime authorities would sail into the gray area and arrest Indonesian fishermen, seizing their boats and accusing them of illegal poaching in Malaysian waters. Then, in retaliation, Indonesian patrol boats would sail into the exact same waters and arrest Malaysian fishermen.
Oh, my goodness.
Hundreds of ordinary citizens were thrown into foreign jails simply for casting nets in waters their own governments told them they owned.
The ultimate collateral damage of a geopolitical choke point.
Exactly.
And it got so bad that they finally had to sign a memorandum of understanding in 2012, essentially agreeing to stop arresting the fishermen and just politely ask them to leave instead, while the politicians try to negotiate a permanent line.
It really highlights just how politically fraught and sensitive this narrow waterway remains today.
Okay, so put all this together. You have a strait that is, at its narrowest navigable channel, barely 1.5 nautical miles wide.
Super tight.
It's congested with 94,000 ships a year. It's environmentally fragile. The two massive nations bordering it still haven't figured out their maritime borders. And it is historically a haven for piracy. If you are a country whose entire economic survival depends on the goods flowing through that specific strait, you have to be terrified.
There is no country more terrified of this geographic reality than China.
Really?
Yeah. In Beijing, this strategic vulnerability isn't just a hypothetical concern, it has a specific, formal designation. It's called the Malacca Dilemma.
Malacca Dilemma. I want to spend some time on this because it seems to dictate a massive amount of modern geopolitics. Just how reliant is the Chinese economy on this one strip of water?
The dependency is almost absolute. China imports roughly 73 to 75% of its crude oil through the Strait of Malacca.
Wow.
It also imports between 65 and 70% of its liquefied natural gas, or LNG, through the same corridor. On top of the energy dependence, about 60% of China's entire container trade, the exported manufactured goods that actually drive their economy, flows through here.
So if the Strait of Malacca closes, the Chinese manufacturing base stops exporting, their energy grid runs out of fuel, and their economy essentially seizes up.
Yes, and the dilemma isn't just about the physical danger of, say, a shipwreck blocking the channel. It's entirely about great power competition.
Right.
While no single state legally controls the international waters of the strait, the United States Navy, operating alongside its regional allies, holds overwhelming maritime superiority in the area.
So the fear in Beijing is that if tensions ever escalated, the U.S. wouldn't even need to fight a war near the Chinese coast. They could just park a carrier strike group at the western entrance of the Malacca Strait, set up a naval blockade, and turn off China's oil supply.
That is the nightmare scenario driving the Malacca dilemma. Washington holds the ultimate geographic trump card over Beijing's economy, and China is desperately trying to find ways to build overland pipelines through Pakistan and Myanmar to bypass it. But the volume they need simply cannot be met by pipes alone. They need the ships.
I noticed in the research that it isn't just China facing this existential dread. The outline specifically highlights the view from Tokyo. How does the ordinary Japanese citizen fit into the Malacca equation?
We often focus on the superpower rivalry, but for Japan, the reality is even more stark and immediate. The Japanese economy is highly industrialized, but the home islands have virtually zero domestic fossil fuel resources.
Right, they have to import everything.
Everything. Japan relies on the Strait of Malacca for a staggering 90% of its energy imports.
90%. That is an unbelievable vulnerability.
Think about the daily life of an ordinary Japanese citizen. The electricity powering the neon lights of Tokyo, the fuel running the massive automotive factories in Nagoya, the heating systems keeping homes warm in Hokkaido during the winter. 90% of the energy required for that entire civilization is reliant on oil and gas tankers successfully navigating a pirate-infested, politically disputed 1.5-mile wide channel thousands of miles away.
That's terrifying.
If Malacca shuts down, Japan doesn't just face an economic recession, they face a literal blackout.
So, if you are Beijing or Tokyo and you're staring at a map paralyzed by this massive strategic bottleneck, you inevitably start looking for a bypass.
Exactly.
And if you trace your finger just a bit further north on the map, you hit Thailand. Specifically, a very narrow strip of land called the Isthmus of Kra.
The narrowest point of the Malay Peninsula. It sits perfectly between the Indian Ocean to the west and the Gulf of Thailand to the east.
If the problem is that sailing down and around Singapore through Malacca is too dangerous and exposed to American warships, why not just play God, dig a massive trench across Thailand, and create a shortcut?
That idea is called the Kra Canal, and it is one of the most hotly debated, high-stakes geopolitical chess games happening in the world right now.
I can imagine.
Thailand is sitting on top of a geographic lottery ticket, and they have two distinct, massively consequential options on the table. Option one is the dream of actually digging the canal.
What would that engineering project actually look like?
It would be monumental. We are talking about a $25 to $30 billion investment to carve a 100-kilometer-long waterway straight through the country, deep enough and wide enough to handle massive crude oil supertankers.
That's a huge project.
From a purely logistical standpoint, it's brilliant. It would shave roughly 1,200 nautical miles off the journey between the Indian and Pacific Oceans, saving shipping companies up to 6 days of travel time and massive amounts of fuel.
Saving time, saving fuel, avoiding the pirate-heavy waters of Malacca. It sounds like a slam dunk. Why haven't they already started digging? Like, why is this still just a debate?
Because of a concept called direct substitution. A crane canal wouldn't just be a helpful backup route. It would fundamentally replace the Strait of Malacca for a massive percentage of global traffic.
Okay, and that's a problem because...
Because that shifts the entire balance of global power. If China can bypass Malacca entirely, navigating through a canal funded by Beijing and located closer to their sphere of influence in the South China Sea, the United States Navy loses its chokehold. The leverage of the blockade evaporates.
Oh, wow. So digging the canal breaks the American monopoly on the choke point. I imagine Washington is doing everything in its diplomatic power to prevent that. But what about India? How do they view this shortcut?
India is equally alarmed, but for different geographic reasons. India currently enjoys a massive strategic buffer zone. They control the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, which are an archipelago sitting right near the western entrance to the Strait of Malacca in the Indian Ocean.
It's like having a guard tower right outside the front door of the strait.
Precisely. India uses those islands to monitor, track, and quietly deter Chinese naval vessels and submarines trying to sneak into the Indian Ocean. It's their early warning system.
Ah, I see.
But if a correct canal is built further north, Chinese shipping and naval assets would emerge directly into the Bay of Bengal, completely bypassing the Andaman monitoring zone. It dilutes India's strategic leverage overnight.
So a canal is a massive geopolitical victory for China, but an existential threat to U.S. and Indian leverage. But what about Thailand? Put yourself in the shoes of the Thai Prime Minister. Someone is offering you $30 billion to build the most important piece of infrastructure on Earth in your country. Do you take the deal?
It's an agonizing choice. Physically carving the country in half with a massive trench physically divides Thailand's southern provinces from the rest of the nation.
That sounds problematic.
It is, Those southern provinces already have a complex history of insurgency and security issues. The military is deeply concerned about literally cutting the country in two.
Not to mention, the moment you build that canal, you lose your neutrality.
Exactly. You are no longer just a rapidly developing Southeast Asian economy. You instantly become the center of gravity for a superpower conflict. You are the guardian of China's primary energy lifeline. If a war breaks out, your country becomes ground zero.
So what is option two? If the canal is too politically explosive, how else can Thailand cash in on their geography?
Option two is the Southern Land Bridge. Instead of trying to dig a trench through the mountains, Thailand builds two massive, state-of-the-art deepwater ports, one on the Andaman Sea side and one on the Gulf of Thailand side.
Okay.
They then connect these two megaports with a 90-kilometer, high-speed, $28 billion railway and highway network.
So the mechanics change completely. A massive container ship from the Middle East docks on the West Coast. Giant cranes unload all the containers onto high-speed freight trains. The trains zip across the country in a few hours, and then cranes load those same containers onto a completely different ship waiting on the East Coast, which then sails up to China.
Exactly. The cargo crosses the land, but the ships stay on their respective sides of the ocean. From a geopolitical standpoint, this provides what military strategists call redundancy without rupture.
Redundancy without rupture. Explain that mechanism.
It gives China exactly what it claims it wants in peacetime:
Okay.
faster logistics, a backup route in case Malacca gets congested, and increased trade efficiency. Beijing is happy because they get redundancy. But, and this is the crucial distinction that satisfies Washington and New Delhi, the physical ships themselves still have to operate in the open waters of the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea, where U.S. and Indian naval leverage remains completely intact. It doesn't radically alter the physical naval geography the way a canal would.
It's a brilliant compromise. You get the economic boom of moving the cargo, but you don't rewrite the naval balance of power. It really illustrates how a few kilometers of dirt can dictate the grand strategy of nuclear-armed superpowers.
It is the ultimate proof that despite all our technology, physical geography still dictates national security.
Which provides the perfect pivot to our next geographic marvel. Because if the Krak Canal in Thailand is this unrealized, highly debated dream of cutting through a continent to save time, the Suez Canal in Egypt is that dream made into a spectacular, world-altering reality. We're moving from the jungles of Southeast Asia to the deserts of the Middle East.
The desert ditch that shrank the globe.
Calling it a ditch almost feels disrespectful to the engineering, but visually that's exactly what it is, a straight line carved through the sand. But the history of wanting to carve that line goes back millennia. You read the sources and it feels like every major empire looked at that thin strip of land connecting Africa and Asia and thought, if I just dig a hole here, I own the world.
Oh, absolutely. The ancient pharaohs attempted early versions of it, utilizing the Nile River to connect to the Red Sea. During the Renaissance, the Venetian Empire desperately wanted to fund a canal in the 1400s.
Wait, why the Venetians?
Because of the Portuguese. Remember when Albuquerque and the Portuguese navigators figured out how to sail all the way around the southern tip of Africa to get to the Indian spices?
Oh, right, they cut Venice out of the loop.
Exactly. Venice had built its entire wealth, acting as the middleman for spices coming overland through the Middle East. They knew a canal would instantly restore the monopoly, but they didn't have the engineering capability. Even Napoleon Bonaparte, when he invaded Egypt centuries later, ordered surveyors to find the remnants of the ancient canals because he wanted to rebuild it to choke off the British Empire's route to India.
But it wasn't until the mid-19th century that someone actually pulled it off. In 1869, a French diplomat and entrepreneur named Ferdinand de Lesseps managed to form a massive company, raise the necessary capital, and finally cut through the Isthmus of Suez.
And the economic impact was instantaneous and revolutionary. By connecting the Mediterranean Sea directly to the Red Sea, Lesseps cut the maritime journey from the Arabian Sea to London by a staggering 8,900 kilometers.
Ships no longer had to brave the brutal, terrifying storms around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa. You just slid through the desert. It completely rewired global trade.
It did. But by creating the most vital shortcut on Earth, it also created one of the most sensitive, explosive geopolitical tripwires in modern history. Because the canal is so vital to European and Asian economies, it instantly became the center of intense military conflict.
Which leads to one of the most surreal, bizarre stories I have ever encountered in the history of global trade. I want to talk about the 1967 closure of the Suez Canal and the creation of the Yellow Fleet.
Oh, it's a phenomenal example of what happens to the human cogs in the machine when geopolitics abruptly stops the machine.
Right. So set the scene. It's June 1967. The Six-Day War breaks out between Israel and a coalition of Arab states, including Egypt. Egypt controls the canal, and their military physically barricades both ends of the waterway. They sink ships, drop mines, and dump debris to ensure no one can use it. But when the barricades went down, there were 15 international cargo ships already inside midway through their transit.
They were completely trapped in the bottleneck.
They had literally nowhere to go. They couldn't move forward and they couldn't turn back. The Egyptian authorities ordered these 15 ships to drop anchor in a wider section in the middle of the canal called the Great Bitter Lake. And they stayed there, not for a week to wait out the shooting, not for a month. They sat at anchor in that desert lake for 8 entire years.
From 1967 all the way to 1975.
I want the listener to really imagine the psychological reality of this. You're a merchant sailor. You signed up for a routine cargo run from Australia to London. You go to sleep, wake up to artillery fire over your head, and suddenly you are permanently parked in a desert lake for almost a decade. The ships sat there for so many years that they became completely coated in blowing desert sand, which is how they earned the moniker the Yellow Fleet.
What is truly remarkable is not just that they were trapped, but how the crews on those ships adapted to an utterly unprecedented situation.
They formed their own bizarre, floating micro-society. You had ships from all over the world: West Germany, Sweden, the UK, Poland, Bulgaria. Initially, they were just waiting for the war to end. But as weeks turned into years, they realized they were on their own. The crews started lowering lifeboats and visiting each other's ships. They formalized their society, organizing something they called the Great Bitter Lake Association.
They essentially built a miniature United Nations right there on the water.
They really did. They pooled their resources and shared supplies. The Polish ship had a doctor, so that became the hospital ship. The UK ships had large refrigerated cargo holds, so they became the grocery store. They threw massive parties on the weekends. They instituted a floating church service. In 1968, to coincide with the actual Olympics happening in Mexico City, the crews held their own Bitter Lake Olympics.
That's amazing.
Right. They competed in weightlifting, water polo, and track events on the decks of the largest freighters. They even created their own hand-drawn postage stamps for the letters they sent home on relief boats. And the Egyptian Postal Service actually honored the fake stamps. It was this isolated, stranded, utopian society functioning completely cut off from the massive geopolitical war happening right on the sandy shores around them.
It is a beautiful testament to human resilience and cooperation. But from an economic perspective, it is a stark, terrifying reminder of the physical vulnerability of these choke points. Think about the capital tied up in those ships.
Oh, sure.
When the canal finally reopened 8 years later in 1975, only 2 of those 15 massive vessels were even capable of leaving under their own engine power. The rest had decayed so badly they had to be towed out by tugboats. The cargo was largely ruined.
And we don't have to look back to the 1970s to understand how fragile the Suez Canal is. We can fast forward to a Tuesday morning in March 2021, the Ever Given.
The modern equivalent of a barricade, caused not by war, but by sheer scale and weather.
I remember waking up and seeing the pictures on my phone. There was this 400-meter-long container ship, a vessel literally the size of a skyscraper, wedged diagonally across the single-lane section of the canal. And right next to it on the bank was this tiny, singular construction excavator trying to dig sand away from the massive steel bow. It was internet meme gold for about 24 hours, until people started doing the math on what was actually happening to the supply chain.
And the math was apocalyptic for global markets. The Ever Given wasn't just blocking a river, it was severing the primary artery between Asian manufacturing and European consumers. Analysts estimated that that single ship stuck in the mud disrupted between $6 and $10 billion of global commerce every single day the canal was closed.
$10 billion a day. How does the math even reach a number that high?
Because of the mechanics of modern supply chains. The global economy operates on just-in-time logistics.
Right, nobody has warehouses anymore.
Exactly. Factories don't keep massive warehouses full of parts anymore. They expect the parts to arrive on a ship exactly when they need to build the product. When the Ever Given got stuck, hundreds of ships piled up in the Red Sea and the Mediterranean, unable to pass. You had ships carrying microchips, medical supplies, automotive parts, and refined oil, all just sitting idle.
And because of the inelastic demand we talked about earlier, they couldn't just throw the ship in reverse and take a different route.
Exactly. Turning a massive fleet around to take the Cape of Good Hope route adds roughly 2 weeks to the transit time. The fuel costs alone run into the millions per ship, so they just had to drop anchor and wait, bleeding money. And the ripple effect was devastating.
How so?
Well, because those ships were delayed, they couldn't reach Europe to unload their cargo, which meant they couldn't be loaded with new empty containers to sail back to Asia. Suddenly, factories in China had goods to ship, but literally no empty steel boxes to put them in, causing a massive container shortage worldwide. The price to ship a single container skyrocketed from a few $1,000s to over $20,000 almost overnight.
All because one ship got caught in a windstorm in a narrow ditch. It is mind-boggling. But what I found truly surprising in our sources wasn't just the economic fragility of the Suez, it was the environmental devastation it caused. We always think of canals in terms of moving cargo, but we forget they also move water.
Yes. The concept is called Lessepian migration, and it is a fascinating, deeply alarming consequence of massive geoengineering.
Break down the mechanics of this for me. How does digging a trench for ships cause an environmental crisis?
You have to look at the geography before the canal existed. For millions of years, the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea were completely separate, distinct marine ecosystems, separated by the solid landmass of the Isthmus of Suez.
Okay.
The Red Sea is a tropical, highly saline, very warm environment with specific flora and fauna. The Mediterranean is cooler, with entirely different endemic species that evolved in isolation.
There is a permanent wall between them.
Until Ferdinand de Lesseps built his canal. When the canal opened, it didn't have locks like the Panama Canal. It was a sea-level waterway. Lesseps essentially removed the salinity barrier that kept the species apart. For the first time in millions of years, salt water flowed freely between the two bodies of water.
And nature did what nature inevitably does. It found the new highway.
Exactly. Marine life from the Indo-Pacific and the Red Sea, which are generally more aggressive, adaptable, and used to resource-poor tropical waters, began to swim north through the canal and colonize the eastern Mediterranean. This phenomenon is called Lessepsian migration, named directly after the man who built the canal.
It is essentially a slow-motion, underwater alien invasion.
That is exactly what it is. And the biological mechanics are ruthless. Since the 1880s, hundreds of exotic species from the Red Sea have established permanent populations in the Mediterranean. And because the native Mediterranean species didn't evolve alongside these new predators and competitors, they have no natural defenses.
Give me an example of the damage. What actually happens when a Red Sea fish moves into the Mediterranean?
Look at the rabbitfish. 2 species of herbivorous rabbitfish migrated through the canal from the Red Sea. They are voracious eaters. When they arrived in the eastern Mediterranean, they began consuming the native kelp and algal forests at an industrial rate.
Just eating everything in sight.
The local ecosystem couldn't regenerate fast enough. Those kelp forests were the foundational habitat for hundreds of local Mediterranean species, providing nursery grounds for juvenile fish and invertebrates. By clear-cutting the underwater forests, the invasive rabbitfish completely devastated the local biodiversity, turning vibrant reefs into barren underwater deserts.
It's an incredible irony, an engineering triumph that literally shrank the globe, brought cultures together, and generated trillions in wealth for humans, simultaneously triggered a catastrophic ecological collapse for the local marine life. You solve an economic bottleneck, and you accidentally create an extinction event.
It demonstrates that when we manipulate the physical world at that scale, the unintended consequences echo for centuries.
And the physical challenges of utilizing the Suez Canal don't actually stop at the canal itself. Because if you're a cargo ship sailing from the manufacturing hubs of Asia, trying to reach the Suez Canal to get to Europe, you can't just teleport there. You have to navigate the Indian Ocean, enter the Gulf of Aden, and squeeze through another gate first. A much more volatile, dangerous gate.
Right, you have to pass through Bab el-Mandeb, the southern door to the Red Sea.
I have to say, whoever was responsible for naming these geographic features historically was incredibly dramatic, but very accurate. The translation of Bab el-Mandeb from Arabic is chilling. It translates to the Gate of Tears or the Gate of Grief.
It is a title earned through centuries of blood and shipwreck.
Why is it called that? Our sources mention the name stems from both the physical danger and an ancient legend.
The physical reality is that the navigation is notoriously treacherous. The currents are unpredictable, the winds are fierce, and there are numerous jagged reefs and small islands dotting the passage. But the legend you mentioned adds a mythological weight to the danger.
Oh, right, the earthquake.
Yeah, according to ancient Arab folklore, the strait was named the Gate of Tears in memory of the sheer number of people who drowned during a massive apocalyptic earthquake that literally ripped the Arabian Peninsula away from the Horn of Africa, drowning the land bridge and creating the strait in the first place.
So it's born out of violent geology. And looking at the map today, that violent geology has left an incredibly tight, claustrophobic bottleneck. The strait sits right between the coast of Yemen on the Arabian Peninsula and the coasts of Djibouti and Eritrea on the African side. Just how narrow is this passage?
At its absolute narrowest point, the entire body of water is only 26 kilometers wide.
26 kilometers. That is a 15-minute drive in a car.
And the navigable reality for massive commercial vessels is far tighter. Because of the shallow depths, the underwater reefs, and the presence of Perham Island right in the middle of the strait, the deep water channels capable of handling massive oil supertankers and modern container ships are severely restricted.
How restricted?
Traffic is effectively forced into just two dedicated channels, one lane for inbound traffic heading north to the Suez, and one lane for outbound traffic heading south to the Indian Ocean. Each of those lanes is barely 2 miles wide.
So you have the entire maritime trade between the industrial engines of Asia and the massive consumer markets of Europe trying to squeeze single file through a 2-mile wide stretch of water. What kind of daily volume are we talking about here?
It is an arterial flow of global energy. The strait handles roughly 12% of all global seaborne oil shipments. In the first half of the current decade, that equated to roughly 4.2 million barrels of crude oil passing through the Gate of Tears every single day, along with an immense volume of refined petroleum products and European-Asian container traffic.
Okay, so we know it's a vital economic artery, but here is the terrifying variable. What happens when an artery carrying 12% of the world's oil runs directly alongside a coastline embroiled in a brutal multi-year conflict?
You get the exact supply chain crisis we are currently witnessing. The geopolitical reality of Bab el-Mandeb is incredibly volatile. Yemen has been consumed by a long-running proxy war, and the coastline directly bordering the strait is controlled by armed factions. Recently, the internal conflict has spilled directly off the land and into the international shipping lanes.
Right. Our sources detail the specific threat from Yemen-based Houthi forces attacking commercial shipping in the strait. How are they projecting power into the water?
They are utilizing a combination of asymmetrical naval warfare tactics. We are seeing the deployment of anti-ship ballistic missiles fired from the coastline, the use of explosive-laden aerial drones targeting the decks of cargo ships, and the deployment of naval mines in the approach waters.
And the impact has been severe enough to completely halt certain types of trade. The sources note a specific cessation involving natural gas.
Yes. The threat environment escalated to the point that the flow of liquefied natural gas, or LNG, through Bab el-Mandeb was stopped entirely.
Wait, stopped entirely, as in zero LNG ships are passing through?
Exactly zero. LNG carriers are essentially massive floating thermos bottles filled with highly volatile, supercooled gas. A direct missile strike on an LNG carrier wouldn't just sink the ship, it could cause a catastrophic massive explosion.
Right, that's too huge a risk.
The major energy companies and their insurance providers decided the risk of navigating a 2-mile-wide channel under active missile threat was simply unacceptable. And this localized threat is part of a broader, ongoing hybrid naval warfare environment extending from the Persian Gulf down through the Red Sea, characterized by shadow wars and covert mine attacks between regional powers like Israel and Iran.
Okay, let's step back and look at the real-world mechanics of this. If I'm paying my heating bill in Chicago or buying groceries in London, how much of that price tag is being dictated by a localized conflict in a 2-mile stretch of water in Yemen?
More than you realize. It comes down to the economic ripple effect. When Bab el-Mandeb is deemed a war zone, the global fleet of container ships and oil tankers doesn't just evaporate, they still have to deliver their cargo.
Right, but how?
Because they can't access the Suez Canal through the Red Sea, they're forced to divert. And the only other way to get from Asia to Europe is to enact the very route Ferdinand de Lesseps built the canal to avoid, sailing all the way south, around the Cape of Good Hope at the bottom of the African continent.
We are reverting back to 19th century trade routes because of 21st century drones.
Exactly. And the mathematics of that diversion are brutal. Rerouting around Africa adds roughly 8 to 9 days of travel time for a fast container ship and up to 2 weeks for a slower, heavily laden oil tanker.
Which means they're burning an exorbitant amount of extra fuel.
The fuel costs skyrocket into the millions per voyage. But that is only the beginning. Because these ships are sailing into higher-risk waters, the marine insurance premiums, the cost just to insure the hull and the cargo surge massively.
Oh, that makes sense.
Furthermore, because every ship is now spending an extra 2 weeks at sea just trying to reach its destination, They aren't available to sail back and pick up the next load of cargo.
So the global pool of available ships shrinks overnight.
Yes. You suddenly have a massive shortage of shipping capacity, freight rates explode, the cost to lease a container triples. And every single one of those extra costs, the fuel, the insurance, the extended crew wages, the premium freight rates, is immediately passed down the supply chain.
Right, to the consumer.
Instantly. It causes immediate systemic inflation. The price of the gas at your local pump, the cost of the fresh produce in your supermarket, the price tag on the raw materials needed for local construction, it all spikes upward, simply because the Gate of Tears is closed.
It's wild to think about. The global economy is so interconnected, so tightly wound, that a rebel group in a fractured state planting a naval mine can directly cause a working-class family in Ohio to struggle to afford their weekly groceries.
It is the ultimate proof of how fragile our physical world remains, despite all the digital advancements we brag about.
Speaking of physical fragility, I want to leave the arid deserts of the Middle East and head into the dense torrential jungles of Central America. Because if the Suez Canal is essentially a ditch dug through sand at sea level, our next choke point is something else entirely. We're talking about the Panama Canal.
Oh, yeah. Building the Panama Canal didn't just require moving dirt, it required bending an entire mountain range, a raging river, and a lethal tropical jungle to human will.
And reading the sources, it almost didn't happen. The story of Panama is essentially a multi-decade saga of insane European hubris, followed by desperate, brilliant American engineering.
It begins with the French, and a name we have heard before, Ferdinand de Lesseps.
Right. The guy who successfully built the Suez Canal looks at a map of Central America and decides, hey, I conquered the desert in Egypt, I can definitely conquer the jungle in Panama.
Classic hubris.
In 1881, he raises the capital, forms a company, and heads to Panama with the intention of digging a straight, sea-level trench right through the country, connecting the Atlantic to the Pacific.
To give you a sense of the arrogance and the scale of what he was attempting, a prominent French historian recently compared Lessep's ambition in Panama to the Apollo moon landing.
I read that analogy, and it is absolutely perfect. It was that ambitious, that technologically daunting, and frankly, the jungle was as alien and hostile an environment to 19th century French engineers as the lunar surface was to NASA. They thought they could just dig a ditch.
But Panama is not a flat, dry desert. It is a mountainous, impenetrable jungle subject to torrential rainy seasons. And right in the middle of their path was the massive, unpredictable Chagres River, which would flood with terrifying force during the wet season.
The geography was punishing, but what truly doomed the French effort wasn't the mud or the mountains. It was an invisible biological nightmare. It ended in spectacular, horrific tragedy. The sources state that over 22,000 workers died. Think about the sheer scale of that number. 22,000 human beings perished trying to dig a hole. I was reading how they died, and it's a masterclass in tragic historical irony. They were being wiped out by yellow fever and malaria. But they had absolutely no idea that mosquitoes were the vector carrying the diseases. They thought it was bad air from the rotting jungle vegetation.
Their ignorance of the biological mechanics was fatal. In their hospitals, the French nurses noticed that ants were crawling up the legs of the patients' beds. To stop the ants, they placed the legs of the hospital beds into small ceramic pots filled with standing water.
Wait, they intentionally created thousands of stagnant water pools inside the hospital wards.
They unwittingly created the perfect breeding ground for the Aedes aegypti mosquitoes. They were breeding the very insects that were killing their patients right next to their beds.
That is just awful.
It was a horrific failure of medical science and planning. After years of mass death, endless landslides that erased months of digging overnight, and massive financial corruption, the French company went bankrupt and abandoned the project in 1889, leaving behind rusting machinery and thousands of graves.
So the jungle unequivocally won round one, but then the geopolitics shift and the Americans step into the ring.
In 1904, the United States takes over the concession and the project, and they bring two crucial paradigm-shifting innovations that change everything. First, before they even started digging again in earnest, they brought in Dr. William Gorgas.
What did he do?
Gorgas understood the new science of mosquito-borne diseases. He implemented a rigorous, almost militaristic campaign of scientific mosquito eradication across the canal zone, draining swamps, fumigating buildings, and installing massive amounts of netting. He drastically reduced the death toll from yellow fever and malaria, making it possible for humans to actually survive the work environment.
So they solved the biological bottleneck. What was the second innovation?
They completely abandoned Lessep's arrogant dream of a sea-level canal. The American engineers looked at the geography and realized it was impossible. The Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean actually have wildly different tidal ranges on either side of Panama, and the Chagres River would simply flood and destroy any trench they managed to dig during the rainy season.
So if you can't dig down to sea level, what do?
You go up. Instead of digging a trench, they decided to lift the ships up and over the mountain range.
Which, when you say it out loud, sounds like science fiction. How on earth do you lift a massive cargo ship over a mountain?
You harness the very river that defeated the French. The Americans built the Gatun Dam across the Chagres River, which at the time was the largest earthen dam ever constructed in the world.
Wow.
By damming the river, they flooded the Central Valley, creating a massive artificial body of water called Gatun Lake, which sits roughly 26 meters above sea level. Then they built a series of massive concrete locks on either coastline to act as giant water elevators to lift the ships up to the lake and lower them back down on the other side.
The mechanics of actually crossing the Panama Canal today are absolutely terrifying if you look closely at how it's done. I was reading about the transit of these specific vessels called Panamax ships. These are cargo ships custom built by naval architects to be the absolute maximum physical size that can squeeze through the older canal locks.
The margins of error during a transit are almost non-existent.
Exactly. Picture a ship that's almost 300 meters long and 32 meters wide, trying to squeeze into a concrete lock chamber that is 320 meters long and 33.5 meters wide. The captain of the ship has less than a meter of clearance between the steel hull of his vessel and the solid concrete wall of the lock on either side. And because the ship is stacked so high with containers, the captain on the bridge can't even see the bow of his own ship.
The risk of a multi-million-dollar collision is so high that the Panama Canal is the only waterway in the world where the captain of a sovereign vessel must legally surrender total control of their ship to a local canal pilot for the duration of the transit.
But even with an expert local pilot, you can't just steer a behemoth like that perfectly straight using a rudder and propellers in a tiny concrete bathtub. The water displacement alone pushes the ship side to side. One bad bump against the wall could breach the hull, sink the ship, and shut down the entire canal for months. So how do they actually keep the ship perfectly centered?
They use mules.
Electric mules, not the animals, obviously. I watched a video of this, and it is incredible. These are highly specialized, $2 million, 50-ton electric locomotives. They run on dedicated cog tracks built right into the concrete walls on either side of the canal locks.
The mechanics of the mules are fascinating. When a massive ship enters the approach to the locks, canal workers throw thick steel cables from the ship's deck down to these electric mules on the walls. Now, the mules do not pull the ship forward.
Right. The ship uses its own engines or tugboats for forward momentum. So what are the mules doing?
The mules act as dynamic braking and centering systems. They maintain constant, perfectly calibrated tension on the steel cables from all four corners of the ship simultaneously. If the ship starts to drift a few inches to the port side, the mules on the starboard side instantly increase tension to pull it back, while the port side mules release slack.
That is so smart.
They essentially suspend the 53,000-ton ship perfectly dead center in the water as it moves forward.
It's like manipulating a high-stakes marionette puppet, but the puppet is a skyscraper made of steel. Once the ship is secured in the center of the chamber, they close these massive, hollow steel gates behind it. And what blew my mind is that they don't use massive industrial pumps to fill the locks with water to lift the ship.
No, the entire lifting mechanism is powered completely by gravity.
Gravity and the water from Gatun Lake. The canal operators open massive culverts built into the concrete walls. Because the lake is 26 meters above the lock, the water simply rushes down through the tunnels and bubbles up from the floor of the lock chamber. It lifts a massive supertanker 8 meters into the air in about 8 minutes. It takes roughly 80 million liters of water to fill a single lock chamber. They repeat this elevator process 3 times to lift the ship 26 meters up to the level of the lake.
The ship then disconnects the mules, sails across the artificial lake, navigates through the Culebra, cut a narrow channel. They literally blast it out of the solid rock of the Continental Divide with dynamite, and then takes another set of descending water elevators back down to sea level on the Pacific side.
It's an 8 to 10 hour journey that saves a ship 2 entire weeks of brutal, dangerous sailing around the frozen storms of Cape Horn. It is undeniably one of the greatest engineering marvels in human history.
It is, but that massive gravity-fed mechanism has a critical, modern vulnerability. And the threat isn't a foreign navy or a rebel group or even political instability. It is entirely environmental.
We're talking about the freshwater crisis.
Exactly. Every single time a ship passes through the canal, completing the transit from one ocean to the other. Those massive locks eventually open to the sea to let the ship out. When that happens, roughly 200 million liters of fresh water from Gatun Lake are flushed out into the saltwater ocean.
200 million liters of fresh water lost forever per ship. And they do this dozens of times a day.
Right, the canal is essentially a massive machine that continuously drains Gatun Lake. Now, historically, this wasn't an issue. The torrential, reliable tropical rains of the Panamanian jungle naturally replenished the Chagres River, which refilled the lake faster than the canal could drain it. The system was perfectly balanced.
But the climate is shifting.
Rapidly. In recent years, severe and prolonged El Niño weather patterns have caused historic, devastating droughts across Central America. The torrential rains simply aren't falling the way they have for the last century.
So Gatun Lake is slowly draining. The water level is dropping. What happens to the ships when the lake gets too shallow?
The Canal Authority is forced into crisis management. First, they have to restrict the draft of the ships.
Explain draft for the listener.
Draft is the vertical distance between the waterline and the very bottom of the ship's hull. The heavier a ship is loaded with cargo, the deeper it sits in the water, meaning it has a deeper draft. When the lake levels drop, the Canal Authority has to mandate that ships cannot sit as deep.
Which means shipping companies have to intentionally leave containers behind on the dock just to make the ship light enough to float through the shallow lake without scraping the bottom.
Exactly. They are sacrificing cargo capacity, which instantly drives up the cost of shipping. But when the droughts get severe enough, restricting draft isn't enough. The Canal Authority is forced to severely reduce the total number of ships allowed to transit the canal each day, simply to conserve the water they have left.
Wow.
You suddenly have dozens of massive cargo ships anchored off the coast of Panama, waiting weeks for a designated slot, completely disrupting global supply chains.
It is the ultimate bitter irony of human engineering. We built a canal to physically connect the two largest bodies of saltwater on the planet, but the entire multi-billion-dollar gravity-fed machine is completely, utterly dependent on fresh rainwater falling in the jungle to function. If it doesn't rain in Panama, global shipping between the Atlantic and the Pacific grinds to a halt.
It is a stark, humbling reminder that even our greatest technological triumphs, our most vital economic arteries, are ultimately completely at the mercy of the climate and the physical environment.
Okay, we have covered incredible ground today. We've examined the geopolitical tensions and unresolved borders of Malacca, the historical tragedy of the trapped fleet, and the environmental consequences of the Suez, the immediate missile threats closing the Gate of Tears, and the freshwater crisis slowly starving the Panama Canal. But there is one fundamental reality that connects all of these massive container ships, all these sprawling global supply chains, and every piece of cargo moving across the oceans. They all run on fuel.
And a massive, disproportionate percentage of that fuel comes from one single, highly vulnerable place.
Our final geographic choke point. The Strait of Hormuz, the ultimate energy artery.
We talked about the other straits being the veins of global trade. Hormuz is the jugular.
I want to look at the numbers outlined in our sources because they are staggering. The Strait of Hormuz sits perfectly between Iran on the northern coast and Oman on the southern peninsula, connecting the oil-rich Persian Gulf to the open waters of the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean. In the first half of the current decade, the data shows it handled roughly 20.9 million barrels of crude oil every single day.
To contextualize that volume, that is roughly 26% of the entire global maritime oil trade.
Over a quarter.
Over a quarter of all the oil moving on the oceans passes through this one narrow gap. The economies of the world are quite literally addicted to the flow of liquid through this specific strait.
But it's not just crude oil, is it? We touched on liquefied natural gas earlier when we discussed the Red Sea, but the sources emphasize that Hormuz is the absolute epicenter for global natural gas.
Yes, this is a critical distinction. While some major oil producers in the Persian Gulf have spent decades building massive overland pipelines to bypass Hormuz like Saudi Arabia, and the UAE pumping some of their oil directly to terminals on the Red Sea, natural gas is a completely different logistical beast.
Why can't they just pump the gas through a pipe to bypass the strait?
Because of the infrastructure required for LNG. To transport natural gas across oceans, you have to supercool it into a liquid state in massive, multi-billion-dollar coastal facilities. Qatar, which shares a massive underwater gas field with Iran, is one of the world's largest producers of LNG. They have built all their liquefaction terminals on the coast inside the Persian Gulf.
So they are geographically trapped. There's no pipeline backup for Qatari LNG.
None whatsoever. They must load the gas onto those highly specialized, volatile floating thermos ships we discussed, and every single one of those ships must sail out through the Strait of Hormuz. Because of Qatar's immense output, the Strait of Hormuz accounts for a staggering 21% of the entire world LNG trade. If the Strait of Hormuz is blockaded, or mined, or shut down due to a regional conflict, over one-fifth of the global liquefied natural gas supply simply vanishes from the market overnight.
And who is buying all this energy? Who hurts the most if the jugular is severed?
If you look at the shipping manifests, the primary destination is Asia. Approximately 84% of the crude oil moving through Hormuz is destined for Asian markets.
We're talking about the massive industrial engines of China, India, Japan, and South Korea.
Exactly. We discussed Japan's 90% reliance on the Malacca Strait earlier. Well, the oil coming through Malacca is originating right here in Hormuz.
So let's map out the cascade of a failure here. If a blockade happens in the Persian Gulf and the oil and gas stop flowing, what happens next?
It triggers an immediate, devastating energy crisis in the Eastern Hemisphere. Prices for fuel and electricity in Asia skyrocket instantly. But it doesn't stop there. Because those Asian economies are the manufacturing floor of the world, when their energy costs explode or their power grids face blackouts, their factories have to shut down. They stop producing electronics, automotive parts, medical supplies, and raw steel.
And when the Asian factories stop producing, the massive container ships we talked about in Panama and Suez have nothing to carry.
Precisely. The energy crisis in the East instantly cascades into a catastrophic supply chain crisis in the West. The shelves in European and American stores go empty. Inflation spirals completely out of control globally. A closure of the Strait of Hormuz doesn't just raise the price of gas at the pump. It is the ultimate trigger for a deep, instant, worldwide economic recession.
It is the single most sensitive pressure point on the global map. Okay, we have literally gone around the world. We've explored the pirate origins and modern dilemmas of Malacca, the historical tragedy of the Suez, the explosive tension in Bab el-Mandeb, the freshwater limits of Panama, and the sheer existential dread of Hormuz. I want to pull all of this together and synthesize the research. What is the playbook? Based on the sources we analyzed, what are the overarching lessons here for everyone listening?
I think we can break the lessons down into three distinct perspectives based on how you interact with the global system. First, let's look at the lessons for the policymakers and politicians.
The people running the nations and the militaries.
Right. For them, the overarching lesson is that national security is inherently, fundamentally tied to physical geography. You can have the most advanced tech sector in the world or the most powerful nuclear arsenal. But it means absolutely nothing if you cannot secure the physical, maritime delivery of the energy required to power your nation and the food required to feed your citizens.
The geographic toll booth trumps the digital economy.
Every time.
Oh, yeah.
Therefore, the key takeaway for policymakers is the urgent, desperate need for redundancy. Relying on a single strait like China, staring down the Malacca dilemma, or Europe relying on the Suez is an unacceptable, almost suicidal, strategic vulnerability. Nations must invest heavily in alternative infrastructure. That means building overland pipelines, developing complex land bridges, like the Thai project we discussed, expanding strategic petroleum reserves, and diversifying their domestic energy sources so they aren't completely held hostage by a 2-mile stretch of water thousands of miles away.
What about the financial sector? The bankers, the institutional investors, the commodities traders?
For the financial sector, the lesson is that the abstract digital numbers flashing red and green on a stock ticker are physically anchored in the mud, the sand, and the weather of the real world. A single ship getting blown slightly sideways by the wind in Egypt, or a drone strike launched from the coast of Yemen, or a lack of rainfall in the Panamanian jungle can swing global commodity prices and corporate valuations instantly.
If you're an analyst building a risk model for global supply chains, you can't just look at corporate balance sheets and quarterly earnings reports.
You have to look at the physical reality. You have to understand how El Niño weather patterns affect draft limits in Central America. You have to track local maritime security patrols in the Gulf of Aden. And you have to know the political friction between two coastal nations arguing over an exclusive economic zone. The physical world ultimately dictates the ceiling and the floor of the financial world.
And finally, what about the ordinary citizen? You and me. The person listening to this right now who just wants to buy affordable groceries, put gas in their car, and order a replacement part for their refrigerator online.
For the ordinary citizen, the profound realization is that our modern, affordable, incredibly convenient lifestyle is highly subsidized by massive invisible risk. The relatively low cost of your consumer goods and your daily energy is entirely dependent on thousands of massive steel ships successfully running a daily gauntlet through precarious, dangerous, and incredibly narrow geographic passages.
We talked about the illusion of the cloud at the beginning. We just expect the digital order to manifest physically. We expect the shelves to be full because we tapped a button. But the reality is that every time you buy a cheap electronic device or enjoy tropical fruit in the winter or fill your gas tank, you are actively participating in a massive, fragile system.
Yeah.
You're relying on a 53,000-ton ship squeezing through a 100-year-old concrete lock with mere inches to spare, or navigating a 2-mile wide channel in the shadow of active missile batteries.
It is a breathtaking miracle of logistics and human coordination, but it is a miracle that hangs by a very thin geographic thread.
It really is. It changes the way you look at a simple map forever. Okay, before we wrap up, I know you always like to leave us with something to chew on. We've talked about the past and the present of these bottlenecks. What is the final provocative thought for this deep dive as we look to the future?
We have spent this entire time talking about the ancient straits and the modern canals that define our current established geopolitical order. But physical geography, just how solid it seems, is not static. As the global climate shifts and global warming continues to melt the Arctic sea ice, we are currently watching the birth of a brand new, historically unprecedented geographic choke point right before our eyes, the Northern Sea Route.
The shipping route cutting right across the top of the globe, hugging the northern coast of Russia.
Exactly. For all of human history, that ocean was an impassable wall of solid ice. But as the ice clears for longer periods each summer, it offers a maritime path between Asian manufacturing and European markets that is drastically shorter than sailing south through the Suez Canal. My question for you to mull over is this. As this new route becomes viable, will the Northern Sea Route finally break the monopolies of the Suez and Panama canals, democratizing global trade with a massive new bypass? Or are we simply watching the creation of a brand new, highly contested arena for bitter geopolitical conflict, just this time playing out in the freezing, isolated waters of the high north?
A new 500-year prize emerging from the melting ice, just waiting to be claimed by whoever can control the toll booth. That is a chilling, fascinating thought to end on. Thank you to everyone for joining us on this deep dive into the physical arteries of the global economy.
It's been an absolute pleasure untangling these global mechanisms with you.
And as always, if you like this talk, please subscribe and like this channel. We will see you next time.